All right. Thank you very much for coming to Introduction to Persona Development. And I think of this as persona play. When you are at an SCA event in your costuming or your garb and interacting with other folks, you have an opportunity to engage in what I call persona play. So this is when you're similar to when you're in character for a live action role play, or you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, pen and paper, but you're speaking on behalf of your character, even though at that point you may not be in costume. And for me, it's something that I really enjoy in the SCA because I find it helps to make the experience more immersive for me. I get a lot more out of it. And so that is what we're going to focus on. Okay, let's see if the slide, there we go. Found my slide controls. Actually, I'll start here, sorry. A little bit of an introduction. When I joined the SCA in the Kingdom of Ontir in the Barony of Sigurd, there was a persona development contest there. It was a one-day competition called the I just finished dinner and all of my blood is in my stomach digesting my food. The Silver Whale. It's the contest of the Silver Whale, and it's a one-day affair. And I'll talk a little bit more about persona development competitions, but there's also in Ontir, but in the interior, the contest of the Golden Swan, and it is a weekend-long competition. Now, it doesn't mean you can't leave the contest area or the competition area. It just means that you have a focused opportunity to demonstrate your portrayal of your persona. And it's a ton of fun. And because I started in the SCA in an area where there was, so that's Ontir, A-N, new word, T-I-R. That's a kingdom.
I was making
it was a pun. It was a portmanteau of
interior.
interior.
I said interior. Oh, you're hilarious.
Out.
You're hilarious. No, we need hilarity. You can stay. All right. So very early on in my SCA time, my SCA experience, I was exposed to the idea of persona play, and that it was a fun thing to do. And I see Bera has joined us as well. Bera, I was talking about how persona development really feeds into the idea of persona play, the idea that you can immerse yourself in the living history experience in the SCA through persona development. So we're going to talk about, here's our agenda. We're going to talk about what a persona is. Oh, my husband's asking me about my teacup, and I brought it upstairs already. Haha. Why it's a good idea to have one. Lots of people don't. They don't see the need for it, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. You don't have to have one.
Yes, you do.
But there are several frameworks for developing personae. I'm going to suggest 3, but this is not at all a finite list. There are other frameworks that you might use, and you can combine these as well. Choosing a name and how that works. So Dietrich and I can, and Reese as well as heralds can definitely reinforce how choosing a name helps in that immersive process. Material culture, where we can actually talk about the cost, the actual financial cost of persona play. Being in persona, interacting with others, and resources. All right. Now, is there anything else you folks want me to talk about while we're in the session today? Lots of shaking.
Well, why don't you go ahead, and if we have questions, I'm sure we'll ask them of you.
Perfect. All right. So what is persona? I have to move the video to the bottom of my screen. All right. So this is essentially an in-depth research project. So of course, those of you who know me well know that that's something that I would really like. A research project, an analysis of whole other human being that you will just happen to wear for the period of time when you're at an SCA event. Now, it should be fictional. It means it can't be historical character, but that doesn't mean that it can't be a fully formed person, entity. Now, everyone in the SCA is assumed to be gentry at the beginning. That means your family has money, you have some land, you have property. You're not poor. You may have a minor title somewhere in your family, and then through your experience in the SCA, you are sometimes recognized and granted additional titles. So that's how we become, Lord and Lady so and so, to eventually being Earl and Count and King, and not everybody gets to be those. That's fine. Now, it's generally discouraged to have a slave or a serf persona, depending on the culture we're talking about, but it's definitely been done. In Ontir, there was an entire household of serfs. Their research was so well done, their persona play was so well done, that everyone in that household is a laurel for that culture. So everyone is called master or mistress, and they hate it because they're trying to pursue persona play as a serf, which is not a lord or lady anything. So it's kind of, I always thought that was rather humorous. Now you can choose from any time frame, any culture, as long as it was known about by Western Europeans before 1600. Usually it's 600 to 1600. Keegan is raising your hand. Yes?
Yeah, I think they've changed that because it's no longer the Western European focus.
Well, do
It
you
just
see
has
what
to
I
be-
actually have there? Known about by Western Europeans.
Yes, I do see that, Scott. I'm not sure that is actually what the corpora says anymore.
It does. As long as there's contact. Not contact necessarily, but this is where you get Samoa, India, because we do have documentation of contact within this time frame. Those other cultures, those contact cultures, are often not pursued for persona development or even name submissions. But we are putting much more of a focus, and I do talk about the context, like where you're from, and encourage the pursuit of those other cultures. So we do talk about that to some degree. But what I do want to suggest or mention, and looking through other resources for persona development in preparing for this class, there are a number of websites, particularly East Kingdom Wiki was talking about persona development, and I suspect there's been quite a discussion or a contention within East Kingdom about the time frame. And I know in Ontir, there has also been this sort of casual idea that, 50 years, give or take, on either side is just fine. Now, for folks who are into dance, who are into fencing, rapier, brewing, adding a little extra time is very friendly to them, because often their documentation is in those years, just after 1600. So they will look to extend a little bit with essentially the rationale that it may have been written at that time, but it's suggested in the analysis of that documentation that there was it's based on something else that would have existed prior to the publication of that documentation, right? So the Playford manuscript, which a lot of our English country dance is based on, was published after 1600. Now, same with the 600 date. We do have a lot of folks who wish to pursue personae that is before 600, and I know Reese is one of them, and for a couple of different reasons. So they want to potentially look at the British culture really before Rome or just after Rome left, or they want to look at like Pictish culture. But it's a challenge when we get to 600 because it didn't exist anymore. It was wiped out or absorbed, depending on who you read. So there's a lot of there's some contention here about the time span that you can look at, but I'll say that I doubt that anyone would walk up to someone and say, that's from 1675. I don't think you're allowed to wear that, because that person would not be very nice. You can tell me about them and I'll find them. All right, so how is it helpful? Well, naming your persona self in a meaningful way helps you to be more greater immersed in the society. Dietrich or Gemma, were either of you around at, I think it was a murder melee years ago when we were at Blue Springs still, and we had a new person in Ben Dunforth who just joined and did fighting that weekend, but he hadn't developed a name yet. And the party on the Saturday night, they kept yelling his modern name.
Steve.
Was it
I
Steve?
think that's Steve.
Yes,
Steve,
I
it was
remember that because
Steve.
Baudouin was the herald for the newbie tournament, and I remember this rather distinctly. He was announcing this, and because Baudouin is a very flamboyant, right? And so going up, call to the list, Yamamoto Morikazu and Steve.
Now
and for months afterward, at Trillies, at Murder Melee, at Pennsic, Eldemarian camps in the middle of the night would just bellow out, Steve! And other Eldemarian camps would shout back, Steve! And he has since picked a name. Buggered if I could tell you what it is.
Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. And when Njal and Lance joined our group and came to the investiture event,
The Evans!
I told them right away. I met with them right away, and I said, we need to find you your SAA names now because you will become the Evans forever. And there are fewer people here now who call them the Evans because Njal is Njal on Facebook. And although Evan is Evan on Facebook, he's Lance when we do weapons practices or when I see him. So it's worked out well for them. And usually that's the trick, right? All right, now it also provides depth and dimension. It helps us as reenactors in our persona play get into the headspace of who your persona is. Now, our Nora Dunstan, she's the one who suggested this, to get into the headspace of your creation and breathe life into them. Have them be a three-dimensional person. It helps if they have a name that's appropriate and all of the other accoutrements. If you kind of look like them, the kind of clothes they might wear, if your hair the way they might. Now, unfortunately, I can't do without my glasses. It's just not good for me to do without my glasses. So that's one accommodation. No, I can't wear contacts.
It is the Society for
Monocles.
Creative Anachronism.
Although I have made medieval glasses, but they don't stay on very well. That's,
Those are
You need
round
the ones with the little handle?
No, they have a strap. I've made one pair out of wood and one pair out of leather.
Oh.
They were also made out of ivory and bone. All right, and the last point, you're in the SCA, presumably partly because you like medieval history. I'm saying, so act like it. Get it? Persona play, act like it.
Oh.
Okay. All right, but there are some things that I would caution you to avoid. Don't name yourself after a real person, a real historical person, a literary character,
It won't be
copyrighted.
allowed anyway.
Don't do that. Yeah, if you were to submit that to the College of Heralds to submit your name and have it approved and assigned to you, that would not work. That would not work in your favor. And
Or at the very
often,
least, not anyone notably historical. If you want to call
That's
yourself
it.
Thomas Baker, I'm sure there were hundreds of Thomas Bakers, but nobody cares, right?
well, and that's it. Even in the discussion that often happens with submissions, sometimes even if it is a modern person, it will come back and say to the submitter saying, are you sure you want to be this person? Because people will know it's this person. So it's
where
also
did I just see that?
confusion.
Somebody said that there was on Oscar. Somebody said, "Are you sure you want this name? Is the person aware
Lance
that it's
Kincaid.
a porn
Lance Kincaid.
star?" Yeah,
Yeah, and he
So that
knew,
was
and he
funny.
knew, and we talked about it, and he said he was fine with it. Well, he's
Yeah.
a 17-year-old guy, so yeah, he's fine. He was fine with it, and we kind of moved on from there. It wasn't this name won't pass. It wasn't a matter of that.
It's
Where
that,
if he had been calling himself Geoffrey Chaucer, that wouldn't work.
I'm Jeffrey
But
Dahmer.
yeah, see, that would still cause someone to say, do they know that's a person who's not a good person to be named after? Do they know that? In some cases, it's a negative connotation that can transfer over to you. You cannot take a name that infers a rank. So Earl, for example, Rain Heather, who submitted her name as an Icelandic name. There was a discussion on whether or not the rain part inferred a rank, but it had previously been accepted and approved, and there was plenty of documentation of it being the name for an Icelandic woman, not necessarily a queen or anyone of specific rank. So that one was permitted. But names like that include Earl and Duke, which are ranks we use in the SCA, have been sent back.
And it depends on the culture too, because like there are some German names that are like König, which is king,
right?
But they don't actually imply, royalty. So it's very. If you can document it essentially being used for a regular bloke,
yes,
you're typically on safe ground.
Now, also try to avoid using a name that someone else is using. The name I had originally chosen for myself in Ontario was Moira, and there were already 3 Moiras in the area, and I hadn't realized that when I chose that name. So doing a little more research into names, and I found Skaya, and I've been Skaya ever since. I really like my name, and I've met people who have names that are similar, but not exactly the same.
I love Sciath. I love the name Sciath.
Sciath? Scaith. Scaith. Yeah.
Scaith.
Scaith. Now,
mine was actually chosen because I was actually known as Jenna for the longest time, Jenna of Rising Waters, and I wanted something similar, but something that was within the culture. So eventually they found Gemma, which was as close to Jenna as they could get.
Mm-hmm.
That's nice.
Okay, so in terms of names as well, no more than 2 languages are generally used in a name. You can only use 2 languages if those cultures who used them had interaction. So sometimes we will jokingly, especially at Herald's Points at big events like Pensic War, we'll jokingly talk about the Netsugushi McTaggart, where it's like a Japanese name with a Scottish name. Yeah, we don't do that. The Highlander is not, it's fiction. It's not real. Not based on historical research. However, cultures that did interact can be combined if you can demonstrate that there were names combining the 2 cultures, the 2 languages. And finally, your name should fit your persona. So if you are looking into a persona that's like a Chinese courier, it's fantastic, kind of cool. Don't name them Sven Larsson. That makes no sense. That's just confusing.
You're adopted or something.
You're adopted by a Chinese family. Yes. From Iceland or Norway. Yeah.
Or you're a Chinese person who was adopted by a Norse family.
So we can talk about.
He said it with a straight face too. I'm quite impressed.
He's good at that.
Or maybe they raided a village.
Okay, let's talk about where you're from. I'm talking about where you're from. I'm going to steam ahead here. You could begin. So this is your framework to develop your persona. You could begin with what culture your persona is from. I chose Scotland because my family has a history in Scotland. So I chose that. And I like kilts and things. And I thought that was cool. And at the time, I didn't realize that family kilts actually only dates to 1822. But I know now.
But they had the great kilt before that, at least.
That's actually just how you wear plaid fabric.
Yeah.
A plaidie is historically something that would have worn in the later half of the medieval period that we do cover. It just means plaid fabric. It just means fabrics of multiple stripes of color. That's all it means. All right. You could consider thinking of culture. And this is one thing that when talking with others, this is sometimes the avenue. You're at an event and they see costume, they want to wear that. They like that costume. Or they see pictures and artwork and they see the style of costuming they want to wear. And then that leads them to a culture. So if you really love looking at some of the Italian Renaissance, especially early Italian Renaissance paintings, which are beautiful, or even the later stuff with the Medici collars, which is beautiful, or the ruffs, well, that's going to infer a particular culture and a time frame. And others will do as I did. They'll look at their family history and go from there. Or just go from their personal interests, right? So whatever way you choose to look at a specific culture, that's fine. That's great. Trying to find my mouse. There we go. All right. Now I'm going to suggest you consider thinking outside the box, right? There are a lot of Norse and Vikings and Scottish people and Irish people and Welsh people in the SCA. Lots.
There's nothing wrong with being Norse.
I didn't say there was. I just said that there's lots. So raise your hand if you're Norse.
So many.
There are two of you. Yes, that's right. Okay.
Actually, technically, I'm Rus, so I'm a subculture.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Raise your hand if you're from a Celtic culture. Yeah. All right. And then followed by French, Italian, and German. Raise your hand if you fall into that. Okay, you go. Now, English, surprisingly enough, has actually fallen into less favor. So there are fewer new English imperialists in development. There's a reason why my persona is from the time she's from in the late 1200s. Now, these cultures make up the majority of the persona that many people develop within the SCA, but I'm going to suggest you might consider some of these other ones. There's Aragon, which is an area of Spain, Asturia, Brittany, Burgundy. There's all these little areas. Provence, Russia is mentioned in there. Although I find in Eldamir we have a fair number of Russian persona, or people wearing Russian dress. Switzerland, Savoy, late period Icelandic and Norwegian. So not that Viking migration period that a lot of folks look at, but that later period when the all thing is in place and Iceland is now declared Christian as a faith and moved forward and is much more modernized than a lot of Western Europe. But anyways, then there's other cultures like Arab cultures, Bavarian, Belgian cultures, Bulgarian, Byzantine. Not a lot of Byzantine characters or personas here in Eldamir. The only one I can think of, often it's Rus, Byzantine. Like there's a lot of crossover in dress, I find, particularly with the collar and the way that they wear.
Selwyn.
Yeah. So there's a lot of crossover in particularly costuming pieces. Persian, we definitely, can you think of one person in Eldamir who portrays a Persian persona?
We do have a few.
Or Egyptian.
Well, I'm not sure if
Japanese.
Valazan is strictly Persian or if he's Arabic. There's a bit of a crossover given his field of influence there.
Well, a lot of what Gypsy wears is actually Persian culture, even though she's more of a Romani culture that she's pursuing. A lot of what she wears is Persian dress, which is really cool, and it's really nice in the summer. Transylvanian, you could be, Dracula, Vlad the Impaler's great grandmother. That's kind of cool. Visigothic. That's awesome. You want to go early
they have
period?
Some lovely jewelry.
You want to go early period? Go Visigothic. You want to do some really cool metalwork? Visigothic. All right. So essentially, you're not limited.
And all the Asian countries as well.
I do mention a
All the
few
Asian
of them
cultures.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean like Chinese.
Far East,
Japanese,
I think.
Far East.
Far East. Yeah. Oriental cultures. So we've talked about where you're from. Now we talk about when you are from. So if you've already decided on what kind of outfit you want to wear, what kind of clothing or armor you want to wear, this can help you to pinpoint the when piece, right? Or if you determine the when piece, and then that leads you to your garb and what wherewithal, your accoutrements. It will require you to do some basic research. And again, you wouldn't be here unless you really like this stuff. So presumably you like the research. So yay. Now, the reason you need to select a culture and time frame is because it helps you determine what names you want to look at to call yourself. So remember I said you need to do that fairly early on, so you have that identity, that immersive opportunity for yourself.
Or just do not introduce yourself to anyone.
Hi, I'm Steve. No.
I'm no
I'm
one.
new. I'm
I have no
new.
name.
I'm new. Yeah.
Yeah, hey, what's that behind you?
Yeah. I'm going to wash dishes in the kitchen now. Bye. All right. So you can also look at what do you do? What do you want to do? So do you already have an occupation or hobby that you want to look at the medieval application of it? As a person trained in librarianship and information studies, I definitely could go that route. And I have looked at book manufacturing and the proliferation of literacy, and particularly in Western Europe. So that's something I could look at that's related to my occupation, but I didn't. And even if, well, here's a piece. I'm going to take a little side note here. So some of my hobbies would include glasswork, metalwork. I've done stuff with leather, lots of different things. And that Scottish lady in the late 1200s wouldn't do any of them. So the things you want to do are not necessarily a detractor from your persona, right? So even though I have that persona from that time and place, I still do the other stuff. I've done blacksmithing. I love it. It's hard on my body, but I love it. Short durations of blacksmithing. Now, over time in the SCA, a few of us have been in the SCA for some time. We're more seasoned Scadians. A couple of us are newer, and over time, you find yourself being introduced to new crafts or activities, service, and things that you, when you first came into the SCA, you never thought that you would be introduced to. I never thought I'd do blacksmithing. Chasing and tooling was not even a thing I'd ever heard of when I joined. And now it's something that I really enjoy doing. Don't do it often enough. And now it's been 2.5 weeks that I've been in a quarantine. Anyways, so eventually, even though when you're starting to develop your persona, eventually you may find yourself doing other things, other activities. You can do whatever you want, regardless of what choices you make in your persona. And finally, your gender and sexuality doesn't dictate your activities, and it doesn't dictate who you can develop as a persona, who your persona story is. If in the modern world, sometimes called the mundane world, if you are a female records manager, but what I want to do in the SCA is something that only men could do, I could develop a male persona. And this is something I think some of us have actually seen. A woman having a male persona and being referred to as my lord or master or whatever rank they might have. That being said, researchers, historians find more and more documentation or support for women and men to be in roles that are non-stereotypical. So a burial site where in the 70s it was initially found or discovered and analyzed, where it was a woman found with blacksmithing tools. The initial interpretation was that they were her husband's tools. The current interpretation is that no, they were her tools, because they're now able to do more thorough interpretation of her bone density, of the skeleton itself, and determine that she was the blacksmith, she was the metal worker, they are her tools.
It's pretty awesome.
It's very cool. So what I'm essentially saying is that the sky's the limit. You can do so much with developing your persona. All right, some more details. Here's a snapshot of more questions you can ask yourselves. Would your persona have been literate in your chosen culture or time frame? A follow-up question, what defines literacy in that culture and time frame? In Scotland, in England, in the British Isles, in France, in Germany, literacy in the Central or High Middle Ages was being able to read and write Latin. Being able to understand vernacular languages didn't count. You could read and write 5 different vernacular languages. You were still considered illiterate. You could, and many women were, taught to read, but not necessarily to write you were still considered illiterate. So literacy, that one question goes on to a really interesting thought process. What type of money would you have used? Would you have used money, currency? Where would you have gone?
Or salt.
Or salt, fish, wool, a good,
Silver.
Is it a coin, or is it what the coin is made out of? Right? What does your persona personally, how does your persona obtain goods? Do you go to a market? Do you pillage?
I have people for that.
You pillage? Do you have people for that? One of the most interesting primary sources are actually inventory lists for noble houses. And often they'll include where they purchased something or acquired something and how much it cost. And that's a really cool record because that kind of fills that gap in information. What type of clothes would you normally wear? How many sets of clothes would you have? Does it change throughout the year depending on the weather? Do you have special activity clothes? How do you tell time? How do you keep track of days? Is there a bell somewhere nearby that you can hear that rings and you go, oh, it's noon. Go, break time, let's go have lunch. Do you have lunch?
For most of us, the answer would be no for that question.
So what do you eat on a normal day? What are your eating habits? Do you have utensils? What are they made out of? Where'd you get them? Did you make them? There's so many questions. All right.
What type of celebrations do you have?
Yes. What are your holy days? Do you celebrate your birthday? Is Easter important? If you're Christian? Or is it Christmas that's important? When do you celebrate those holidays? Do you go to a confession? What's confession like?
Do people come to you for confession?
Do you go to church? Do you sit down at church? Do you stand up at church? How often do you go to church? There's so many questions you could be asking, and they all seem to lead to other questions. Well, let's go to names. We're going to stop asking questions briefly. So once you've selected your name and your time frame, this is where you can select your name. This helps you triangulate the list of names you can go to. Yeah, let's narrow the field a little bit. Now, each culture had its own naming practice or manner in which the names are put together, the different elements of the name. And to fit it, it's always recommended you talk to a herald who can help you, get through this a little more quickly. Heralds are heralds because they love heraldry. They love putting names together. They love putting armory together. It's something that I really enjoy. I know it's something that Dietrich enjoys, and Reese is quickly becoming a convert as well, which is excellent.
It's fun even when it gives me a headache.
I know. Enough. I have to go get some tea and come back to it later.
I just want to point out that I am not a herald.
You don't have to be a herald, but there are heralds who can help, right? And on Facebook, there's a heralds group, and guaranteed there's several heralds group. You can go into any of them and say, help, I'm putting the Scottish persona together. I need help. There will be 30 people who respond within seconds, maybe 10 minutes, 30 people within 10 minutes. That's what I'm going to say. Yeah. I feel like we should experiment with this and test it out. Now, it's always best to be as authentic as possible because the name you come up with first, like I mentioned, I came up with Moira first. And the name was fine. It was documentable. There are too many other people named Moira. It just didn't, and it didn't really fit me. Didn't fit right. So one of the things that I've recommended to people who I help with their names is that they test drive it a little bit. Live with it for a little bit, write the name out, put it on a wall. Is that my name? Go to an event, have people call you that name. Do you respond? I actually respond to Skaya more often than my modern name.
I didn't know your modern name until
recently.
A month ago.
Yeah. I find it easier just to give SCA people just my SCA name. Just makes it easier. Now, the other piece here is that as you go through the society, you'll become known for things you do, things you say, things you produce, sometimes good things, sometimes not great things. But in any case, you want it You want them to be you, attributed to you, right? You're developing your reputation, and you should have your name associated with that. So more on names. Again, be authentic, historically accurate, and a herald to help you find the sources to do it. It allows you to get into your persona better in the long run. Remember, Skaya? Yeah. That's how I usually refer to myself. All right, so no matter what time frame, so each name is generally composed of a minimum of a first name, your given name, and a last element, sometimes referred to as a byname, but there can be alternatives to a byname. Now, this isn't a class on name heraldry, so I'm not going to get into a huge amount of detail, because I know not everyone here is interested in heraldry, and that's fine. So last names are generally known for as bynames, but you can also have a name that is what's called a locative. So Reese of Anglesey is a locative. So Reese from Anglesey. And they're generally given to an individual. So a nickname is another route you could go. But it's not generally a nickname you give yourself. And it's the same historically, as true historically as it is today. People tend not to successfully give themselves nicknames that other people would use. And it would be the same historically. Now, Dietrich, have you worked with anyone on nicknames in the past?
Oh, well, the Old Norse has some hilarious
Oh, yeah.
descriptive bynames. My particular favorite, I've not seen anyone who's actually registered it, but there's one from the land Namabog, and it's specifically a feminine descriptive byname called Narabringer, which literally translates as merchant ship bosom. So it's basically
love
going,
it.
hey, ship tits.
Yep, love it. Now, that's not something you would call yourself.
Not typically, no. The other
Presumably.
ones, but I have worked with, so Mywin, Mistress Mywin, her name is Mywin Scroutybrock, which
that's
is literally, it's my favorite.
Yeah.
It literally is fancy pants.
Yeah.
Right? And I was, when she did that, I'm like, she sent me the bits. I'm like, that could work. And you could totally see how someone would get that name. It's like, look at these silk pants I brought from Byzantium. It's like,
right?
Oh, there she goes. She's got to put her bloody pants again.
They're fancy pants. Look at her. But the other piece here is the opposites, right? So Jim the Short, who's actually 7'2", for example.
Yeah, sarcasm is period.
Sarcasm is very period. And also name spelling variety. You can find one document where the same guy is referenced for tax purposes, but his name is spelled 4 different ways. It's spelled with a locative, it's spelled with his byname, it's spelled with his descriptor. He's the same guy, and they spell the name 4 different ways. The name standardization isn't something that really happens until much later in period.
If at all, like William Shakespeare famously, we've got 6 of his signatures and none of them are spelled the same way.
Yeah, exactly. Same with pronunciation. Other people have pronounced Skaya in different ways, but I'm the one who wears the name, so I tell everybody what I want it said as. It seems to work for me. And because it's a Gaelic name, we have it's difficult to do research in historical pronunciation. Because those nice pronunciation guides are not provided in historical texts, unfortunately.
I get Gemma a lot.
Right. All right.
Ooh.
Let's talk about finding your name. So books on period church records, parish rolls, consensus lists, tax rolls, these are great sources. They'll refer to real people rather than literary sources.
Gravestones.
Often,
Gravestones.
Gravestones are great, though a lot of them are wiped out by now. You want to avoid name your baby type books and websites. They're usually more modern names and will attribute things to them like meaning of a name. And in the medieval period, unless it's a descriptor, there's not a lot of meanings attributed to names. Which
again,
is,
depending on culture, of course.
Again, yes, depending on culture. In Asian culture, you will find meaning can be attributed to names. Asian culture, sometimes in some Arabic speaking cultures as well. But in addition to this, if it's a culture that is familiar with the Christian Bible, or any book of faith, that's not a great source for names, because translators and editors will have done their magic with all of the text, and they will have revised everything to a more modern pronunciation. They're not great. But there are 3 recommendations on how to identify a good source. So a good source would give you an identification of where the name came from. What was the original source? So Kagan, Dietrich mentioned Icelandabok. There's your source right there. Like, gives a clear identification of specifically the date, the language, other contextualizing information, including the source. Gives an indication of any editorial work. Has it been abbreviated? Has it been transcribed? If it wasn't originally in a Roman alphabet, was it in Cyrillic? If it moved from a Cyrillic alphabet or an Arabic alphabet, what did that translation process do to the name? Right? Let's talk about material culture. So material culture is the stuff that you have to help you portray your persona. So you've got your persona in mind. You have a picture in your mind of who your persona is. Now you need to sort of flesh it out, fill it out, right? So you need clothing. What would Skaya wear? Well, Skaya, unfortunately, doesn't wear anything much different from what they wear in England. And Skaya is from the lowlands, so she's not going to wear your stereotypical Scottish clothes either. In the SCA, we sometimes call it garb, although in periods, sometimes garb is just the raw material that's used to make fabric. That was an enlightening thing for me to find out. You would have accessories. Do you have a purse? How do you carry your valuables? If you're going to market, how do you carry your funds? Do you have favors?
My servant.
You're gentry. Do you have servants? If it's cold where you are from, and north of England, Midlands, it gets cold in England. It gets cold in Germany. Definitely gets cold in Russia. What does your cloak look like? What do you wear when it gets colder? Feast gear. Do you have a glass that you use, or do you use something that's made by a potter? Would it be the same for all meals, or do you have different sets depending on what the meal is for? Martial equipment. If you're involved in any of our martial activities, what does your armor look like? Is it
like that?
It's going to cover me and save my butt, and it will qualify me during an inspection. Then that's my armor. Right now, that's my armor for rapier. Archery, is the bow you use something that you would have used at that time in place? We know archery is something that we can find historically, especially in the Mary Rose Museum. There's a lot of interesting artifacts that they were able to extrapolate from what they found. Weapons. I really enjoy watching armored combat because they use such a wide diversity of weapons, and now that we can use spears and rapier, it's even more exciting. But the list goes on, right? So in archery, crossbows. Could you use were there crossbowmen in Scotland? I don't know. Maybe. If there were, I want to look into it because maybe I want to use a crossbow. Throwing knives.
1200s, right, Ska? If I recall
13th
correctly.
century. So
yeah. Okay. So
late 1200s.
yeah, they totally had crossbow.
I know. There's only so much time for me to do stuff, though. I have the limit.
Well, yes, that is a problem with the SCA.
Right now,
it's like a gas. It expands to fill all available time, space, and money.
Okay, so so we're going to talk about that. Yeah. So tournament and event gear. So you're going to Crown Tournament. It's largely an outdoor event. I'd say probably 75% of the time it's an outdoor event, depending on the weather, of course, and the temperature. If it's sunny, it's outside, right? So do you have some kind of watching pavilion or something that you can have or erect and watch the tournament? Do you have a period chair a medieval chair you can sit on and watch with a table that's covered. You can put food on the table with your feast gear stuff. Oh. Event gear. What do you bring to an event? Do you bring a basket? Who brings a basket? Raise your hand if you bring a basket. I bring a basket. Who brings a box?
Yeah, I guess feast gear, yeah.
Who brings a box? Who brings a sack of stuff? I bring sacks of stuff. Yeah.
I haven't been to one yet, so.
You went to Blue Dragon though.
Yes.
Yeah.
I brought
counts. That
a
counts.
backpack.
You brought a back. That
And a bin.
qualifies as a sack. and sacks are historical means of conveying something. Bringing
Yeah, it's your
something.
cloak when it's warm out. You're using your cloak.
And finally, camping. So you see, we're getting more and more as a something that not everybody has, but sometimes there are things on my wish list. I don't have a tournament shelter. I would love a tournament shelter. Sir Richard has one. It's really awesome.
It is.
Right?
It's like a wall-less canopy tent kind of thing.
Yes.
Well, it's sort of, it's basically there's like a low front wall.
He calls it
right?
his ladies' gallery.
Right, and then it's kind of it's sort of a angled shade over top.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so it's open on 3 sides. Well, partially open on the front. Right,
It's
so
lovely.
the idea they sit behind it, and they've got a little cover for heavens forfend that someone should fall at them.
Protects their fair skin and noble countenance. And then finally, camping gear. So I'm still pretty much camping in a tent, a pop-up tent. Well, not a pop-up. I haven't been in a pop-up in a long time, a cabin style. But the plan is, since being invested, that I would be using the baronial pavilion. That's the plan.
How many people want like a caravan wagon?
Well,
Good plan.
Right? Yeah, I'd love.
Hopefully it works out better than our plan.
I know.
Admittedly, they're strictly not that period, but they're also really awesome, so nobody minds.
I want a yurt.
Don't care what one
A
anyway.
yurt?
Yeah, exactly.
Yurts are awesome.
Yurt.
Yurts are awesome. Yeah, having a what are they called? What are they called? The caravan thing.
Bardo?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And there's groups on Facebook where either you're interested in it or you've got one where you can be members of that group. The challenge I find with that is you need a vehicle that can pull one.
Yeah.
I don't have one of those.
Your SUV should be able to pull something like that.
It's an SUV-like vehicle.
Better than my wee baby Yaris.
Oh, yeah. Which you've pulled stuff in that.
Lots of stuff and bottomed out the whole way.
Oh, no. So when we get into camping gear, we're not just talking about a French bell, a Varda. We're not talking just about a pavilion or whether or not you have a pop-up tent you can kind of hide behind all the other really pretty tents, which has been my strategy so far. But you can expand that. You gotta eat food. You gotta cook food, presumably. And there the picture is of a period kitchen setup. That's the one I want, actually, right there.
It
they're
looks
awesome.
simple enough to make.
They're simple enough to make when you have
It's
the
more
time.
transporting it is the issue. Because they do take up space.
Yeah.
And then there's the stuff you put in your tent. How do you hang up your clothes? Because I'm going to want to hang up my dresses. What do you sleep
I don't
on?
have that issue.
What blankets do you have on your bed? What kind of mattress do you have? I'm not using a straw mattress. It will be memory foam. But you won't be able to tell. You won't be able to tell.
You tuck a little bit of straw around the foam.
Some rushes. Put some rushes on the floor.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a fairly
Good
clever
idea.
and cheap way to make it look period.
It's a and carpets. There are manuscripts from period, particularly actually in German manuscripts, some English manuscripts later on, where they show the interior of tournament tents, and there are carpets inside the tent. So we know they're in there.
Piece of fabric, so yeah.
Is it bare walls, or do you hang a tapestry inside your tent? Do you paint your tent walls? Like, there's all these interesting questions. And then
too much.
So,
Oh, no.
okay, we got to
You
slide
will be
14.
tested on this later.
Now.
We got to slide 14 before someone is done with the questions. Okay, let's talk about being in persona. So, as with anything, How far you are able to portray your persona is entirely, in this slide I say it's up to you, but really it's not just up to you. It's up to you and how others receive it, how they help to participate in it. Some people will develop accents for their personas and speak as their persona might. I've heard folks speak in forsooth language and try to speak in sort of a Shakespearean Middle English dialect, which I think is hilarious.
Yeah, that would just make me.
But just see, I'm just interested to see how long they can keep it up.
I'm learning Welsh for my persona, but that's about as far as I'll go.
And then there are other people who don't do much further than coming up with names and wearing some costumes. And there are some people who just wear costumes. And then they go to events and talk about Star Trek and board games and all the modern stuff that they do. They only go that far. So how far you want to go to being in persona is to some degree entirely up to you, but you need the other people that you relate to help you do it. So let's talk about interacting with others. So many will not interact in persona at all. I've gone to events where my intention on the way to the event is to interact in persona, and I will struggle for the first 2 hours to do it, but I will find people, a friend after friend, and all they want to talk about is work and computers and the internet and Doctor Who. And like, oh, I'm trying not to do that. So it can be tiring, but it is worth trying. The more of us who try to do it, the more of a immersive experience the SCA can be, events can be. So what I haven't done is negotiate with people in advance of an event that, okay, so Dietrich, we're going to Crown. I want to be in persona before lunch. Will you help me? Would you want to do it too? Because we can interact with each other in persona. It just means we can't talk about computers or Doctor Who or Supernatural or
Sorry, who is this doctor you speak of?
Hold up an out of character card when you want to say something like that.
So that's one possibility. Talk with others and find out, okay, in this time frame, I want to be in persona. But what I will let you know is being in persona is mentally exhausting, because the first time people are trying to do persona, often it's they're not sure how to do it because it becomes spouting off facts that you know about a person who would have lived in that time and place. Well, I was educated in a nunnery in the north of France during the reign of King Alexander in Scotland. Like,
that's great, but do you want some stew?
A person who lived in the late 1200s in Scotland would never say that. A person at this time would never say that. I live in Canada, just north of the United States, where the president is Donald Trump, and he's an idiot. Like, no, okay, they say that. They do say that part. Now, in terms of interacting with other characters that are from other times and places, there is actually a fair amount of research that talks about interacting with other cultures, and generally they're strange or they're foreign. You don't know where they're from. So I am a late 13th century persona. I could interact with someone from a much earlier time who is Welsh, and he's just foreign. I don't know he's from a different time. I know he's from Wales because my husband's from Wales that sound kind of the same.
You look weird.
Your dress is odd.
Your dress is a little...
but that's because you're foreign. Right? So you're just foreign. You're strange. It's not something that has to be, we fought you in the Crusades. It doesn't have to be that, right? Although that is something, if you make an agreement in advance with another persona, that could be fun. So we're going to talk about enchanted campgrounds and competitions. I promised we'd talk about comps, and I'm going to. Now, I got some of this content here. That's why there's so much here. From what Cariadoc had written, Duke Cariadoc had written about enchanted grounds. So he's been king of the West how many times? He was one of the first ones. And he's been around in the SCA for like 4 decades.
I thought he was king of the East and Mid, not the
Oh.
West. But I could be misremembering.
Yeah, he's been king of several kingdoms at this point, right?
Well, famously, he
Oh.
is the king that challenged himself to the First Pensic War and lost.
Yeah.
Shouldn't that be changed to like emperor at that point? If you're king of several different kingdoms.
Yeah, not simultaneously.
So an enchanted ground is an area usually at a campsite, but I've seen it at events when there's a competition happening, where within that boundary, and usually it's a roped off area. In that area, anyone in the area should be in persona. So when I visited the enchanted grounds at Pensic, I take my glasses off there. It's not great. I don't like that part because I can't see anything. Kind of sucks. But if I were my persona,
Just wear a helmet. No one will see you.
If I were who I am portraying myself as, she would have had really crappy eyesight. She probably would have been used to it and not missed having corrected vision. But she would have been fairly used to it. It might not freak her out as much as I don't like it. So the enchanted ground gives that opportunity at an event where here you can be in persona. Here the conversation is an authentic medieval topic. Outside of it, talk about Star Trek, talk about Doctor Who, Harry Potter, computers, the internet, whatever, coronavirus, I don't care. But inside, Black Death. Outside, coronavirus. Inside, Black Death. Okay, so the plague. They didn't necessarily, I don't know if they called it Black Plague. There were conversations about Dance Macabre, though. Anyways, we're getting off topic. And then finally, persona competitions. So this is the opportunity where you can demonstrate, there's two pieces to this. You demonstrate the interpretation of the research you've done, of the kind of introspection you've done based on that research. Usually it has an interior area, that roped off area, where you are portraying your persona. And the competition part is other people will come in and interact with you. Sometimes they'll come in to trip you up. They're coming in to trick you. But sometimes they're there just to, it's curious, it's different, it's something that's new, and they want to see how it works. The external area where at some point the candidate who's in the competition comes out, then they usually answer questions about the research they've done. And it's all those questions, right? So you don't ask a person in persona, what kind of cutlery do you use when you sit for feast? Like, you don't ask that. But outside of that competition area, so tell us, what kinds of industries are in the area where you would have lived? What kind of dwelling would you have lived in? Would you have bathed? I mentioned the Golden Swan competition in Ontario, and traditionally, for the first several years, it was only women who were entering into it. And one year a guy entered, and he was a fencer who, his persona was a drunkard. And he spent most of it passed out or drunk.
Did he win the competition?
Well, the thing is that you're not competing against each other. You're competing against kind of like the standard that you set for yourself.
In his case, particularly low standard.
Well, no, he had done research. His garb was good. His garb was authentic. The sword that he used was authentic for his persona. The fact that he was drunken was, he said, because he was the fourth son of a noble house. He had no industry. He wasn't married. He wasn't going to inherit. He had no. Oh, Jen's off. Bye, Gemma. So there's those two areas, and it's tons of fun. I love it. So summary. So as an individual, as you continue in the SCA, your persona continues to evolve. So how Sciath began in 2019, mic went out, I don't know, is not what Sciath is today. Sciath has definitely evolved through time that I've had in the SCA, but my mundane self has evolved as I've lived my life as well. So when I say developing a persona, it's really developing a three-dimensional, fulsome persona, person this is what I mean. So people develop over time, and your persona should too. Your persona doesn't have to be stationary either. So my persona started off in Strathclyde. Well, Yoan entered my life, and now my persona is in the north of Wales. That progression is actually a logical progression that I could document with the marriage of noble houses, that the woman would move to the Lord's house if he was the wealthier of the two. So Sky has not been stationary, and she's definitely changed in her status, in her society, in her life. And my status has changed in the SCA as well. So it's evolved over time. So it should change and grow with you, both in how you evolve in the SCA and where your interests go in the SCA at the same time. So some folks will begin the SCA looking really at one goal, really want to be a fighter, really just want to do blacksmithing. But that focus can change because you discover new things, or you find out, yeah, maybe I don't like being hit. Maybe I don't like bruises. I really like weaving, though. Weaving or pottery, that's really kind of cool.
Fighting to weaving.
Yeah. I don't like being hit. I like hitting things.
Yeah. Well.
But ultimately, what's that?
Violent.
Well, ultimately, don't let yourself be limited. That's where I go here. Don't let yourself be limited. Feel free to have your persona evolve as you
Or have more than one.
You can have more than one. It does get confusing, though, to have more than one. So here are just a few resources that I'm going to leave you with. I mentioned Lady Arnora Dunstan's resource. This is actually a link to the PDF for her resource. It is an older handout for a persona development class, but it is useful. This is the East Kingdom's, Baron Motors, it's not East Kingdom, research questions for developing persona. Remember I said there are lots of questions? Lots.
Can you provide these to us?
Yeah, that link.
We can't click those.
You can when I post this PDF to the group.
Then yes.
Okay, hang on. I'm gonna click this link and then I'm gonna share it. New share. Persona 1. Okay, so here's research questions for developing persona, and it's a white page, so I'm very pale now. There are lots of questions. And then he provides scoring. So if Rising Waters were ever to do a persona development competition as part of their events, which I think would be awesome.
Yes, it would be.
We could do scoring. I don't know if we could really want to do scoring. I don't know.
That might be a little bit of a down to people who aren't good at research.
Yeah, it could be discouraging. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but that's why we have Sciath.
Well, no, you have to do your own research.
No. Look,
That's why we have Sciath.
Look, here's your local library. Books are really cool. Use books. They're great. Use the internet. Look, here's the
that's
link.
why you have Sky.
Here's
Exactly.
Well,
Sky is not going to do all of your work.
Sciath is library and books and online research and internet all in one.
Look, speaking of Skya and research, here's a new share I'm going to share with you. I think it'll be this screen. Maybe it'll be this screen? No, it'll be this screen. Haha. Look, here's the Kingdom of Eldamir Library. We just submitted our badge. On this site, you don't have to be a member of this site if you've got a research question. All you do is say, I need to know more about very early period Welsh culture. Can someone help me develop my persona? Reese has just requested to join the Kingdom of Eldamir Library. That's proactive right there. That's very proactive.
What? No.
And the members of that group are actually librarians who have access to academic libraries. So they have access to resources that if you're not a university student, you probably don't have access. Stefan has just joined the group. You probably don't have access to. All right. The last one here, the online medieval source book. This is a fantastic resource. Can everyone see it? Oh,
yes.
Do I have to share it? You can
Yes.
see it? Can you see it?
Fordham University?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Woo! Okay, let me X that. All right. See, internet, medieval source book. Here are the subjects all here. These are primary source document pieces, full text sources, selections, saints' lives, lots of cool resource material in saints' lives. There's a whole section on sex and gender, social history, intellectual history, social classes. Remember I said don't do slaves and peasants? Well, the first thing they look at are slaves and peasants. So medieval people reflected in literature, law, theory, and practice. And look at these sources available on law. Really cool stuff. It actually self-refers to its legal section, its law history section. Exploration. You want to be an explorer? Fantastic. Let's be an explorer. Let's talk about Western Orientalism or maritime culture and conquest. Tons of stuff here. Now, if you ever have trouble reading some of it, because a lot of it's translated from Arabic language to English, let me know. I'll help. 16th century, 1557, really cool stuff. All right, so yes, I like doing research. There's a reason why I was laureled for applied research. And I hope to convey my enthusiasm for research to other people. The way that I approach it is...
Ooh, there's films.
There's a listing of medieval films that are actually good and authentic. The take I have is that if you're interested in a topic, you likely will enjoy doing the research because you like
Research
the topic.
doesn't feel like research if you like it.
It doesn't. If you like it, you'll do it. So finally, I want to say thank you for coming to this introduction to persona development. If you want to have a chat with me sometime about persona development and doing that deep dive, I started doing my persona development when I was in the Navy after I'd first joined. So my ship would come back from Southeast Asia into Esquimalt near Victoria. And then I would go to the UVic library where I wasn't a student. So I had to go to the library physically and do all this research. And then 3 years later decided, I really like doing research. I think I'm going to leave the Navy now and go back to school. And I never left. I'm still there. I'm in grade 38 this year. It's great. So that's the end.